Hey all, howdy, welcome to One for the Books. I'm Sandy Broadwell, and today we're gonna geek out. We are gonna crunch some numbers. This is my 2025 reading stats video. So if this sort of video isn't for you, then I hope to see you in the next one. But if you're a numbers nerd like me, stick around. Let's dive in. So, I read 59 books this year for a total of about 22,000 pages. I technically read 60 books this year, but there was a reason I didn't count the 60th one. I was averaging about 5 books a month, or about 1,800 pages a month, which, as you can see, is quite different from 2025, where I was reading almost 1,000 pages more every month. So that's mostly because I was unemployed for the majority of 2025, and I think 2026 is probably a little bit closer to my average moving forward. But I also had a pretty big reading slump, as you can see, in March, April, and June, where I only read 2 books per month in those months. So those were outliers, and there was a lot of life stuff going on in those months. But I think 5 or 6 books a month is probably pretty on par for me. My most read authors this year were Richard Swan, Tamsin Muir, and Matt Dinniman. I read 3 books each from all of those authors. And my second most read authors that I read 2 books each from were Becky Chambers, James Islington, and M.A. Carrick. I read 27 fantasy books this year. These are all of them. And just so pretty. Fantasy has the best covers. I read 17 sci-fi books this year, and I'm hoping to up that number in 2026. I read 6 horror books, always one of my favorite genres that I did not devote enough time to. I read 3 nonfiction and 1 poetry, and I read 5 books that I didn't read enough in any of these categories to really count them individually. This is a mix of general fiction, historical fiction, and 1 children's book. Also, 19 of the books that I read this year were new releases, so that's a pretty big portion of my overall reading. That's pretty exciting, and I would say the majority of these were a really good success. According to Storygraph, the books that I tend to read the most have moods that are adventurous, then dark and mysterious, and I think that definitely lines up with my reading taste. Here's another visualization of my genre breakdown, so you can see it kind of all on one chart with the fantasy, sci-fi, horror, general and historical, and nonfiction. I only completed 5 series this year, which is a pretty low number for me and the reading that I've done over the last several years. I have them broken down by the size of the series is by page count. So The Empire of the Wolf was the longest series I completed this year. Then the Library Trilogy, Emily Wilde, and then The Forever Desert is a novella trilogy, and The Monk and Robot is a novella duology. I also started 14 different series this year, which is wild, but I am not going to continue with 6 of them. These are my series DNFs, where I read the entire first book, but I'm just not feeling the series enough to read the sequel. And I have 8 series that I started this year that I am absolutely going to continue, and I'm either actively putting the next book on my TBR or I'm waiting for the next book in the series to come out. I also continued 2 series this year that I both did not start in 2025 and did not finish in 2025. The Singing Hill Cycle and The Captive's War, I read new books in that series to continue them, but those series are not complete yet. 30 of the books that I read this year were in a series, and 29 were standalones, which is almost a 50-50 split, which is wild. I usually read a lot more books in series, so this was a big standalone year for me. How I acquired all of the books that I read, the vast majority were from the library, as always, and the second highest category of how I acquired books was through local indie bookstores, which is very exciting, very proud of that. 4 of the books that I read this year I received as gifts. I did buy 2 books on Amazon and 2 books from Barnes & Noble, and I also found 1 of the books in a Little Free Library. As far as the age of the books that I read, 32%, like I already mentioned, were new releases that came out in 2025. Bonkers. As you can see, the vast majority of my reads this year, well over 50%, were within the last 5 years. I had 15% of my reads that came out between the year 2000 and 2020. 10% of the books that I read were published in the 1900s, and 5% were published in the 1800s. 27 of the authors I read from this year were women, and 23 of the authors I read from were men. And the vast majority of the authors that I read from were white, 37 white authors, 13 authors of color. 28 of the authors that I read from are from the United States, and 22 authors are not from the United States. And 31 of the authors that I read from are brand new to me authors, which is really exciting. And 19 of the authors that I read from this year were authors that I had read from in the past. As far as the format of how I consumed these books, 55% of my reads were ebooks, 38% were physical books, and 7% were audiobooks. According to Goodreads, the highest rated book that I read this year was The Will of the Many, which has a whopping 4.59. Wow, very beloved book. And the least well-liked book that I read this year was The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and I'm not upset to see that one isn't super well liked. It's a very strange one. The oldest book that I read was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, which came out in 1865. And the newest book that I read was The Strength of the Few, which just came out in November. The longest book that I read this year was also The Strength of the Few. It is 720 pages, so quite the chunk. And the shortest book that I read was Live Suit, which is a novella in the Captives War trilogy. I'm very excited for book number 2 in that series to come out this year. My most mismatched Goodreads ratings this year, the most overrated book that I read was The Ashfire King, which only has a 3.99 average rating on Goodreads, but I only gave it a 2.5. This was one of my most disappointing reads of the year. And the most underrated book that I read this year, Fireborn Blade, only has a 3.74 on Goodreads, and I gave it 5 stars. I think this book is fantastic, and more people should be reading this. Very underhyped. The most popular book that I read this year in terms of the number of Goodreads users that have added it to a shelf is Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmis, and the least popular book that I read this year was The Memory of the Ogiesi, which is the third and final book in the Forever Desert trilogy, which only had about 2,000 people on Goodreads added to their shelves. This year I purchased 29 books, and I read 55% of them in the same year. So feel pretty good about those numbers. The average rating that I give a book this year was a 4.21, which is very high, but I know my taste really well, and I tend not to pick up books that I don't think I'm going to like. The average length of a book that I read this year was 373 pages. As far as the pace of the books that I read, Storygraph says that the vast majority of the books that I read, 59% were medium paced, 22% fast-paced, and 8% slow-paced books. The final stat that I have is the page numbers. So 29% of the books that I read this year were short books, less than 300 pages. 47%, about half of the books that I read this year, were medium-length books between 300 and 499 pages. And about a quarter of the books that I read this year were lengthy chonkers, over 500 pages. That's it. Those are all of my reading stats from the year 2025. I would love to hear what you think is the most interesting stat that I shared, or if you have any reading stats about the number of books that you read or something interesting about your own reading you'd like to share. I'd love to hear about it down in the comments. Thanks so much for hanging out today. I'll see you next time.